Thank you. Our fourth and last question, and we'll start with Jon. Is there one issue that the Democratic Party should make its primary focus? That is, there are many challenges facing our country inside and out. Is there one issue that can unify and exemplify what the Democratic Party represents, and why?
If you think about just about any problem that our government either refuses to solve or seems unable to solve, you can find the malign influence of money, big money, anonymous money, corporate money in politics at the root of it. Okay? Talking about healthcare. And I mentioned this earlier. Pharmaceutical companies, insurance companies wield tremendous influence over our elected representatives. And the tragedy of it is, the solutions are not that complicated. And there's actually broad public consensus on many of these issues. Most Georgians and most Americans agree that everyone should have health care, period. We agree. So why doesn't it happen? Because of the influence of big money and political corruption in politics. Most Georgians agree it is unacceptable that we are the worst in the country for maternal mortality, that half of our counties have no OBGYN physician, that our state's leaders, because of their partisan obsession and their contempt for the poor, have refused to expand Medicaid. David Perdue and many of his fellow travelers in Congress, and by the way, it's not just Republicans, are held deeply by the influence of lobbyists and trade groups in Washington. The environmental crisis, we've talked about it. The power of the NRA, we've talked about it. My first act as your U.S. Senator will be to co-sponsor a constitutional amendment to overturn the Citizens United decision and get anonymous, dark money out of our political system once and for all. It is corruption that is at the root of so many of these problems. And I have some basic convictions. One of them, as I said, is that the solutions are not mysterious. Another is that most people actually agree on more than we might believe. And if we can root the corruption in our political system, and it's deeply rooted, if we can root it out, if we can expose it, if we can attack it, then we can build the kind of world we want to live in. We can build the kind of world that we will be proud to leave our children. Thank you.
The number one thing that the Democratic Party needs to do in this election is reclaim the issue of democracy, to understand that a bedrock principle of this nation is one person, one vote. And so we need to understand that without free and fair elections, this country we love so much will be changed irreparably. And so we have to amend the Voting Rights Act to apply to all 50 states, because whether you're a North Dakotan, you're a Native American Indian that is being marginalized by the state legislature up there, or whether you're a minority in the South that's being marginalized, as we saw right here in Georgia in 2018 with votes being taken away and not counted, or whether you're in the Southwest United States and you're of Hispanic origin and for some reason people think your vote shouldn't matter, those days are done. And so the Voting Rights Act has to be amended, and we need leaders in Washington, D.C. who understand the importance of that. We also need to understand that we have got to get foreign influence out of our elections. What is happening right now was a major concern of the founding fathers of this country, and to think that these hundreds of years later it has finally come home to roost is a disgrace to this country. And I want to tell you that the founding fathers envisioned that there would come a time when foreign influence would affect our elections, and that at the highest level people would partake of that influence. And they said if we allowed it to continue, then those who are participating in it would be the authors of our mismanagement and disgrace. And so this buck stops right here. No more influence of foreign elections. We have got to pass legislation. We have got to invest in our CIA, our National Security Council, the resources that we need to make certain that we're not having foreign influence in our elections. We need to understand this dark money. And with Citizens United, what has happened is exactly what we predicted, is that now we have foreign investors coming in to invest in our elections through these dark money entities. And we've got to find a way to deal with it, because our nation hangs in the balance. And the free and fair elections of this country envisioned some 240 years ago depends on us finding a way out of this.
It's hard to pick just one. I could talk about student debt. I could talk about banning assault weapons. Talk about corruption in our democracy. Talk about a $15 minimum wage. But I'm going to talk about something that I think actually is, in a way, core of the history of the Democratic Party and a painful history of our country. And that is the legacy of slavery. It's the legacy of slavery, the legacy of Jim Crow, the legacy of discrimination in our communities and fair housing and employment. And you've heard a lot, I think, from Democrats around the country saying we need to pass the House bill that would create the study committee on reparations, which is great. We should do that. When someone says they're going to do a study committee and they're a politician, that means they're like, we'll just talk about it later. Okay? And I hope that we actually can have a true study commission and a greater and broader truth and reconciliation commission. Because the history of our country, the reign of terror that has existed for 100 years, people alive today that have that memory imprinted in their family history, in their genes almost, is appalling. And people just don't know that history. I have a plan to deal with reparations through housing remedies. There's a really good book that came out last year called The Color of Law. There are people today alive who could not gain access to the American dream of home ownership when vast majorities of middle-class white families, my parents, my grandparents, benefited from the generational wealth building that comes with home ownership. It's through de jure segregation. All right, that's a fancy way of saying legal discrimination, legal segregation, enforced by zoning laws at municipalities and county commissions, by housing tax credits at the state and federal level. It has disproportionately gone to support white families and against black families from having home ownership. As a result, we have a whole generation of black Americans, all right, specifically this group, a core group of the Democratic Party, that deserves some sort of reparations. And I'm suggesting that it be done through housing remedies. There's a very multifaceted way we can go about doing that, but that needs to actually be the core message that we talk about when we're talking to our Democratic primary voters, because we will not win Georgia, okay, without the black vote. And the Democratic Party needs to stand with black Americans.
So this one's quite personal for me. Many of you know that the level of voter suppression and shenanigans at the ballot box we saw last November here in Georgia was unprecedented. And the number one thing that the Democratic Party can do across this country to unify this nation and move our country forward is to protect your right to vote. Full stop. And see, here's the thing, guys. We like to talk about government dysfunction, but when we have access to the ballot box and our votes are accurately counted without foreign interference, we can change those dysfunctional policies. We can get rid of those dysfunctional politicians. But we can't do it without the steering wheel on the car. and that's your right to vote. So here's the thing. The 400 bills that have been passed by a Democrat-controlled U.S. House of Representatives, anybody know where most of those have gone? Into Mitch McConnell's graveyard. That's right. He calls himself the Grim Reaper for a reason. John brought up earlier universal background checks. More than 90% of Americans, including majority of gun owners and a majority of Republicans, support universal background checks. And a majority of the NRA, you're right, Bev. And here's the thing, you know why we don't have that law? The House did its job. The House passed universal background checks in part because Lucy McBath went there and took care of business. We don't have universal background checks as a law, not because we don't all agree as a nation, that's a good policy, but because Mitch McConnell's the majority leader in the Senate. If we have the right to vote, if we're not worried about hundreds of polling places closing across the state of Georgia in disproportionately Democrat and or minority polling place areas, then we can change that dynamic. And guys, it's not just background checks. It's pension relief. You know, I talked earlier about what it was like this summer to struggle to save 2,200 union employees' pensions in my company. And here's the thing, the House of Representatives did its job. They passed the Butch-Lewis Act for pension relief at the end of July. Anybody know what Mitch McConnell and the GOP in the Senate did?
Went on vacation.
They went on vacation, that's right, Ben. They not only didn't take it up, didn't debate it, didn't mark it up in committee, they literally went on vacation. Anybody remember when they worked through recess and vacation to pass a tax cut for their wealthy donors? Yeah, see, they thought that was urgent, but it wasn't urgent enough to protect working folks. But when we protect the right to vote, when we make sure that 80,000 people who wanted to cast a ballot last year in Georgia never got there, or the 54,000 voter registrations that were held up on a signature match law, when we make sure that doesn't happen, every one of these issues you've heard tonight can be changed, and it can be changed starting in November of 2020. Thanks so much.
Thank you. So we now turn to